One thing that has become a real problem in One Piece is nepotism. It seems like everyone now has to be the child of someone important, or the descendant of someone important, belonging to some special race. It feels impossible these days for someone to just be the child of random parents. How could someone strong possibly be the child of someone weak? That doesn't exist here anymore. And it's getting to such a surreal point that we really need to talk about it, especially now, after this story about Buggy being the second son of Rox D. Xebec. Not yet confirmed, but just look at the bounty posters of each of these guys. Tell me they don't look exactly alike. First, let's do a recap and a list of the nepotism involving the Straw Hat crew, talking about them one by one, and then we'll move on to other important characters in the series, and comment on what I think about all of this. Let's go. When it comes to the Straw Hats, for a long time we didn't have a complete picture of their backstories. We saw fragments of their lives, we understood their motivations, their traumas, the stages of life that shaped who they are today. But even so, several of them still have a gap, a missing piece, that Oda has been exploring in recent years. The first one I want to bring up is Sanji. At first we knew Sanji as a child who worked as a cook on a ship, but it wasn't until the whole Cake Island arc that we discovered Sanji's past. Before that period, we learned that he was the prince of the Germa kingdom, which is why his wanted poster originally had the words, "Only alive." He even had an entire arc dedicated to facing the traumas of his past, and despite the arc's flaws, it had many beautiful moments, like Sanji fighting Luffy, and Sanji finally being able to stop being such a skeptic, and start believing that together with his crew, they could overcome these adversities, any adversities. In fact, from the very beginning of the story, Sanji has been going through this process of moving away from being such a cynical and disbelieving person, and instead becoming more of a dreamer. Actually, he already dreamed of the All Blue, but he never thought of truly going out to search for it. That's what we saw back in the East Blue arc, when he told Zoro to give up on his dream, while he himself refused to pursue the All Blue, even though he believed that this legendary sea really existed. And that's how it was in Whole Cake, when he didn't believe it was possible to deal with a threat as big as Big Mom, figuratively and literally speaking. But anyway, the point is that Sanji was revealed to be the prince of an important kingdom in the world of One Piece, but at least that ended up being important for developing his character in some way. As for Zoro, at first the boy seemed to be just some random orphan who grew up in a village of samurai. Well, in this case, swordsman from the East Blue working extremely hard to become the best in his dojo. But a year ago we discovered that Zoro was never just any boy. He belonged to the Shimotsuki clan, one of the most important in the entire country, and consequently he was a direct descendant of none other than the legendary samurai Ryuma. And by extension, he was even a distant cousin of Quina. Have you guys ever stopped to think that Zoro was actually Quina's cousin to some degree? And here's the kicker. What should have been explored directly within the arc was completely ignored, and instead revealed only through a simple SBS question, where Oda clarified Zoro's entire genealogy and how his ancestors ended up in the East Blue. In the end, this discovery didn't affect Zoro's life at all, since he himself never even found out about it. But for us, besides the neglect of not having this revealed and explored in the manga, at least not yet, because I still hope one day this information will reach Zoro's ears, the real problem is that it made us feel betrayed. Why? Because Zoro has always been the embodiment of hard work, the guy who needed to train 300 times harder to get stronger. We saw this when he was a child, training far more than anyone else just to catch up to Quina, and yet still losing all 2001 times. We've always seen Zoro lifting weights on the ship, way more than the rest of the crew, but then, when we discovered that he was actually the heir to the greatest swordsman the land of Wano had ever seen, it leaves a bitter taste in our mouths. Does this erase everything Zoro has done to get stronger, all those years of training he had to endure? No, it doesn't erase it. But we have to admit, if Zoro hadn't been a descendant of a historically talented samurai bloodline, then he would have had to work twice as hard, 200 times harder than he already did. Let's be real, this guy is going to become the greatest swordsman in the world at only 21 years of age. And if he didn't have the genetics he does, it's very likely he'd only achieve that dream at 30 or 40. Have you ever stopped to think about that? And it's funny to think about how Oda decided to suddenly drop this revelation that Zoro is descended from Ryuma, something that had always been a very popular theory within the fandom, and honestly always made some sense. But in order to try to balance things a little, Oda decided not to give too much spotlight to Zoro's immediate family. Back during the arc, everyone thought that this guy named Ushimaru was actually Zoro's father, because honestly, just look at the guy and tell me he doesn't look like a blue-haired Zoro. But no, Zoro's actual parents were only revealed later, once again in a mere SBS. So maybe Oda did this to try and balance things a little, saying that Zoro was a descendant of the greatest samurai Wano had ever seen, the god of the blade Ryuma, while at the same time showing that his direct parents themselves might not have been all that special. Now, let's talk about Luffy, which is by far the most chaotic case of them all. From the very beginning of the story, Luffy was never just some ordinary boy. Even though we first knew him as a random kid from the East Blue who wanted to be strong and sail the seas, a lot like Zoro in that sense, he was never just some average boy. In chapter 100, Oda introduces us to a man named Monkey D. Dragon, none other than the most wanted criminal in the world. It's only confirmed later that he was actually Luffy's father, but his very first appearance, saving Luffy, was already a huge hint at that connection, not to mention the fact that they share the same name. Then, in chapter 154, Oda reveals that Luffy shares the exact same surname as Roger, none other than the Pirate King himself. This immediately sets up the possibility of some kind of family connection between them. Later, Oda drops yet another revelation. Luffy is the grandson of Garp, a vice admiral and the marine who carries the title of Hero of the Marines. So from the very first half of the series, Oda had been carefully building up the idea that Luffy was no ordinary kid, but instead came from an extremely powerful and influential bloodline. And even though none of this was explicitly stated in the earliest chapters, Oda was preparing the ground for those reveals so that they would feel natural when they came. He introduces Dragon saving Luffy, gives them the same family name, but doesn't immediately say he's the father, yet it was obvious. Then he later reveals Roger's real name, not Gold Roger, but Gold D. Roger, showing the parallel with Monkey D. Luffy, and later on introduces Garp. And from there, the pattern kept growing. However, after the time skip, things escalated to an entirely different level. On Fishman Island, a character named Joy Boy is mentioned for the first time, and almost immediately we start associating this figure with Luffy as the one who will finish what Joy Boy himself could not. It's no coincidence that, further down the story, people even begin calling Luffy Joy Boy directly. But it was really in the Wano arc that things escalated for real. In the middle of the arc, a character named Who's Who mentions for the very first time in the series a figure called the Sun God Nika, a liberator who came to free slaves. Who's Who himself had once been a government agent, tasked with transporting the Gomu Gomu no Mi. A few chapters later, we all saw what happened. The shocking revelation that the so-called rubber fruit was in fact the mythical zone of the sun god Nika. The fruit, that for decades we thought was just an ordinary rubber fruit, had always been a god's fruit. Let's be honest here guys, there's no way Oda had this mapped out since the very beginning of the story. He simply didn't plant enough elements early on to organically lead into such a massive twist. This ended up being the biggest plot twist in the entire history of One Piece. Sure, we can nitpick and dig for micro foreshadowings or little connections, but let's face it, Oda didn't really build this up or warm us up enough for the reveal to feel completely natural. Instead, it seemed more like a decision made along the way and then retrofitted by connecting it to a few scattered elements he had already presented, like the mention of a sun god way back in Skypiea for example. But anyway, the point is, Luffy went from being a boy who already came from an important family to someone who inherited the single most important fruit in the entire series. Honestly, I wouldn't even be surprised if the first Joy Boy turned out to be a direct ancestor of Luffy, and maybe his name was Monkey D. Binksu. Remember the old song Bink Sake? Exactly. That sake supposedly belonged to a man named Binksu, and perhaps that very man was the original Joy Boy, a direct forefather of Luffy. Now of course we can discuss whether Luffy's fruit being a mythical god fruit undermines his own effort and skill in mastering its potential. Personally, I don't even think that's the real issue. The real issue is how exhausting this trend has become. That everyone must be special, a child or relative of someone important, or must have inherited some extraordinary power or legacy. Beyond being exhausting, the bigger problem is that it makes it harder for us to connect with the characters. As ordinary people, we want to believe that we can become great, just like that random kid from the East Blue who set sail chasing his dream. We want to believe that if we work hard, we'll have a chance to become the best in the world, or at least someone remarkable. We want to believe that. But when we discover that our favorite character has actually received some kind of inheritance, whether genetic, financial, or otherwise, we can't help but feel a bit betrayed. We start to feel like we never even had a chance of being as great as that character, because, in the end, they were always one step ahead of us. It's like finding out your classmate at school has a secret allowance of $100,000 or even $1 million just sitting there, waiting for him the moment he turns 18. That's why nepotism usually sucks, especially when it's pushed to the extreme, as it has been lately in One Piece. Just to give a few more quick examples here still within Luffy's crew, there's actually a very strong chance that other Straw Hats have also always been more special than we thought. Nami, for instance, is very likely the princess of some kingdom, and Oda might still explore that. There are plenty of hints scattered throughout the series, her physical resemblance to other princesses, the many official illustrations where Oda himself draws Nami as a queen, the mysterious gap in her backstory before she was rescued in the middle of a war, and several smaller but still important pieces of evidence. Usopp is also very likely a descendant of Mont Blanc Noland. Both are portrayed as great liars in the eyes of others, yet their lies always turn out to be true. Usopp himself even claims to be Noland's descendant during the Dressrosa arc, and we know how Usopp's lies tend to come true in the story. He even wears a knot-shaped headpiece that resembles Noland's hairstyle. If that weren't enough, both Usopp and Noland share the exact same blood type in the series, so the connection between them is practically undeniable. More recently, Oda also began to flesh out Brook's past before he became a pirate. We learn that he once served as the leader of a royal guard, which immediately led many fans to speculate whether he could have once been the commander of the Holy Knights of Marie-Joie. After all, if he was the head of a kingdom's royal guard, maybe that kingdom wasn't just any kingdom, but perhaps the most powerful one of all, the world government itself. And finally, the cherry on top of the Straw Hat crew, the bizarre possible family connection between Frankie and Queen, one of Kaido's calamities. Where did this theory even come from? From Oda himself. In an SBS, he casually revealed that Queen had abandoned his child 26 years ago, completely out of nowhere. And coincidentally, or maybe not, Frankie, who is now 36 years old, was abandoned at the age of 10, which was exactly 26 years ago as well. Why, Oda? Seriously, why? And outside of the Straw Hats, we could still point to a whole series of other examples, especially among the Yonko. Shanks was confirmed to be a celestial dragon from the Figarland family, which honestly was already expected, right? Considering the level of authority and respect Shanks commanded, even among the highest ranks of the Marines and the world government, it was very similar to Doflamingo's case. Blackbeard, meanwhile, was recently confirmed as the son of Rocks, something that also made sense and had been long speculated. But Buggy, on the other hand, being the supposed second son of Xebec, that one still doesn't sit right with me. I find it unbelievable how some people have already accepted this absurdity, as if it were the most normal or worse, the most amazing thing in the world. Beyond them, there's also a strong possibility that Kaido was an illegitimate child of Herald, a prince of Elbaf. The similarities between the two are overwhelming, and the parallels keep stacking up. Kaido shares the blood of the ancient giants, just like Elbaf's royal family. His Ragnarok technique clearly mirrors the legendary Ragnarok of Elbaf. His introduction scene, jumping from a sky island and surviving, echoes Herald's own legendary leap from the top of the Red Line while escaping the world government, also surviving the fall. All of this makes a lot of sense in suggesting Kaido belonged to that royal lineage. Maybe not a direct son of Herald, but at the very least someone who carried the blood of Elbaf's royal family. Then we have Whitebeard, who was likely a member of the still mysterious Buccaneer race. The resemblance between Whitebeard and Kuma, both in face and physical build, strongly hints at this. But Whitebeard's case bothers me a little, because the very core idea behind his character was that he was just this incredibly powerful man who earned the title of the strongest man in the world, yet his greatest dream was nothing more than to have a family. Whitebeard didn't belong to any prestigious bloodline, he didn't have a famous last name, he was simply Edward Newgate, just a man who longed for family, but still became the strongest in the world. Whitebeard was never meant to be special, and that was exactly the point of his character. So, seeing Whitebeard included in the list of characters who belong to a special and powerful race ends up betraying that original intent, that what truly made him special was precisely the fact that he wasn't born special. As for Big Mum, our dear Charlotte Linlin, she might actually be the only emperor who breaks this rule. As incredible as it may seem, she doesn't carry the blood of the giant race. Despite her massive size and absurd physical build, she was simply born as an anomaly in the world of One Piece. And sometimes, that's perfectly fine. She doesn't need to have a famous last name or belong to some race that explains her super strength. But now, in the most recent manga chapters, Oda has completely taken the brakes off. We were reintroduced to the Rocks Pirates, and this time we got to see some figures we had never seen before. The first of them is Don Marlon, who is very clearly the father of Capone Big. Both come from the West Blue, both share that gangster visual theme, and even the name Don Marlon is inspired by actor Marlon Brando, who played in The Godfather. We also finally met Ochoku, who is clearly the father of the brothers Caribou and Koribu. Just look at their faces, the pointy ears, and that long thin tongue sticking out. It's obvious. There's also speculation that the admiral killed by Rocks may have been the father of the current fleet admiral, Akainu. That would explain Akainu's extreme hatred for pirates, a grudge that seems to run all the way back to when he was just a child. We don't yet have solid evidence for this, but it would give Oda a perfect opportunity to fill in this gap in a coherent way. And given One Piece's current trajectory, it's very possible he'll decide to make this connection. And finally, there are good reasons to believe that Mihawk, the world's strongest swordsman, also belongs to a noble family, specifically the Nerona family, the same bloodline that Imusama descends from. This would neatly explain why the two share such strikingly identical eyes. So the conclusion to all of this is that, as I've been saying throughout the video, yes, the fact that every character now seems to need to belong to some important family lineage or inherit some kind of special divine power does take away part of that connection we feel with them, because it betrays that feeling that maybe, just maybe, we could be a little like them. I'm not saying everyone dreams of jumping into a barrel and throwing themselves into the sea like Luffy, but rather the mirror we create between these characters and our own lives. And I get it, it's fun, and it even becomes a sort of game where you try to figure out who is whose father, who is related to whom. That can be entertaining, and I recognize that in many cases these family or lineage connections do make a lot of sense and fit very well into the narrative. For example, Kaido being a descendant of the royal family of Elbaf makes a lot of sense. Maybe Oda won't make him a direct son of Herald, but rather a more distant relative who still carries the royal bloodline of Elbaf. Shanks, for instance, being a celestial dragon, makes perfect sense and justifies his actions during the Marineford War. But when it comes to Blackbeard, for example, I don't think there was any need for him to be Rock's legitimate son, and especially not Buggy in all of this. For heaven's sake. Blackbeard, or even Buggy for that matter, never really needed to be Rock's direct bloodline. Maybe Blackbeard could have simply been a boy who inherited Rock's will in a more indirect way, or perhaps had Rock's very soul implanted into his body, which is something I and many others believe might have happened. But it wouldn't require a blood relation at all, especially when we stop to remember that One Piece has always hammered home the idea that bonds that aren't tied by blood can often be even stronger than blood ties themselves. So this trend, this oversaturation where everyone suddenly needs to be someone's child or heir, I feel it cheapens that message and runs a bit against one of the core themes of the story. So even though one of the three things that cannot be stopped in One Piece is the will that gets inherited, that will doesn't always need to be passed down through a blood relative. It's beautiful, for example, to see how Koby has been carrying on Garp's will, wanting to become a new hero of the Marines, even though the two share no blood relation whatsoever. Koby is like the grandson Garp's will always wished he had, despite not being tied by blood. Now, just imagine if Oda went crazy one day and revealed that Koby was secretly some distant relative of Garp all along. It would completely kill the beauty of that relationship. And again, I still believe that most of these bloodline connections are very well crafted by Oda. But lately, it feels like there's so much nepotism going around in the story that it's undeniable. A sense of fatigue starts to set in with this oversaturation. But anyway, I want to know your opinion down below. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What do you think about all of this? Let me know in the comments, because your feedback is always super important. And once again, don't forget to check that you've left your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos, alright? See you next time. Goodbye.